Sound is good.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's go ahead and see about getting started then. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming in and watching. I know that I had a presentation or webinar a couple of months ago where I had talked about some SSIS, and we went into a lot of technical demos. So this time I wanted to change things up a little bit. So what we're going to be talking about is when you have to do redevelopment. So when someone comes in and you've got to make changes to a process that may already be in production or not in production, but you're kind of doing, a second go around of it, if you will. So let's get my slides working here. Okay, so I'm Jason Granite. If you were at my previous webinars, you have already seen this slide, so I apologize. But I've been in IT since the early to mid 2000s. I've worn a whole bunch of different hats as a developer. So I've done hardware-related stuff in the help desk or systems admin work. I've done web, ETL application, SQL development, and I've done all kinds of analytical work. Currently, I am a consultant for Pragmatic Works, and I typically work in the BI stack, so SSIS, SSAS, reporting services, and Power BI. If you want to follow me, my Twitter handle's there, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn if you choose, if you like what you see, and you'll know the next time that I put on webinars and that sort of stuff. So let's have a quick introduction here about what we're going to be going over. So today we're going to discuss the ideas around development and the subsequent redevelopment of a given process. For those of you that had been in the previous one, I had talked about, we were really demo focused in that one. This one is not going to be as focused on demos. We do have a couple of demos, but most of it, I'm going to be talking about the philosophy around design, and then additional questions and things that we can ask, or things that we may not necessarily think of as we're working on a process. So the first part of this presentation will focus on those questions around development. We're going to talk about some challenges that we might initially face during our development, reasons why we might revisit that process for development, and we'll talk about things that I think are important to cover during this quote-unquote second touch that you might have on a process, and then some actual specific questions to ask that are beneficial, and then items that you can focus on. The second portion of the webinar here, we're going to talk about examples that I've seen as I've been out and about, and also, to be fair, probably things that I have also done before at some point during my developmental career. We'll talk about T-SQL. We'll talk about some nuances regarding, join selection in conjunction with where clauses, and then also the idea of extraneous tables that may be found inside of your selects. We'll talk about how the data patterns may help you to convey what you're trying to do for future developers, or, even yourself. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but, there are times where you go into something and you look at it and you're like, holy cow, this is really complicated, or this is a really slick piece of code. I wonder who wrote this. And you scroll up and you're like, oh, well, that was me. Gosh, I must have had my Wheaties and some coffee this morning, when I wrote it. So, for future or yourself, knowing what to convey for what you're doing is important. We'll discuss when you're transitioning data with your lookups or merge joins. If one of those is going to suit your needs, maybe both of them will, maybe only one of them will. And finally, we're going to talk about utilizing case and aggregates for pivoting your data, which I've seen, in a number of different places. So let's talk about what limits our initial development. So when you're in there working, a couple of things came to mind while I was putting together this slide right away. So how many times have you been assigned to a project and the next thing that you hear out of their mouth is, hey, this is a top priority and we need to go live by the end of the week? So I'm sure you've also heard the alternative, which is we've missed the deadline and I need this done ASAP, so just drop everything and just get it done, right? So time can definitely be a negative factor in our development, because if you're not familiar with the whole process and you don't have time to kind of get the whole picture and wrap your head around it, the idea of all those moving pieces, some may get lost in translation, or you may not, give it as best of a go as you could have on that first go around, which is okay. There's times where you might be the only resource available to work on a project, so you can't take off all of your other hats that you're wearing in order to focus solely on it. In small shops or places where you do multiple roles, it can be tough and you'll spread yourself thin as you overcome that challenge of getting all of your other items done while still getting this new development that is very important completed and finished. And finally, the knowledge and the skills that you have, I feel like, can be a strong contributing factor. There are times where you may need to look up an API or file specifications in order to determine what the process needs or what you need to have it do or have it accomplish. There were times in the past where I can remember one in particular where the company I was working for had bought a new package to handle shipping software. So it was a shipping software package. And during one of our meetings, our IT meetings, they had said, hey, who's worked with VB script? And I said, well, I've dabbled with some VB scripts. I know a little bit about it. Suddenly, next thing you know, I was the subject matter expert, and I'm working trying to look through their documentation for, how to programmatically ship a package, using VB scripts to kind of enhance the functionality of what their base software was. So, me saying, hey, listen, I know about this, suddenly I'm the expert and I'm thrown into that role. So that can be a developmental challenge where your skill set, you need something new to add to it. So, those are problems or issues that we might see on the initial development. So let's talk real quickly about why we redo a process, right? Why might we come back to a process? So the first three, you can see I've got stars next to, and I feel like these first three are the ones that you see a lot of times. They're the most, I'm not going to say important, but they're the most frequent or common ones that you might see. So for performance or scalability reasons, right? So performance and the ability for that process to scale are a huge reason for this second go around. It could be that the initial process worked fine during the development. When you were testing with like a month worth of data, it ran fine, right? It was super quick. It worked wonderful. It accomplished everything you needed. 6 months or a year in, that execution time, someone comes to you and say, man, this is crazy. It's just unacceptable, right? It's falling outside of our SLAs, or it's clogging up other processes and it's keeping those from running. So, that initial development being geared towards a number of transactions, you may have seen a 10 or 100-fold increase in that number of transactions. It just wasn't developed for that size and that scale. So, another item here when you talk about that performance is there are times, and I've seen it before, and I've been part of it before, where you have a process and then someone says, oh, we just need to bolt on this other thing so it can do this. And then, all right, now we bolted that on, we just need to bolt this on, right? So you end up with this sort of bolted on spaghetti of things that have sort of come together, and it's just added and added and added. So the idea of coming back and being able to look at it all from the big picture, can be beneficial. As there was a time I remember when one of our developers was working on an XML parsing process, and they had pushed, they had done a POC for it, they had done their testing, they had pushed it out into production, and they came to me and they said, hey, Jason, we need you to take a peek at this. I said, sure, no problem, what's going on, right? They say, well, we run this process and it takes 45 minutes to process completely. And I said, all right, that's okay, no problem. How many times are you doing this? And they said 6 times a day. I said, okay, no problem. So we've got 45 minutes, we're running it 6 times a day. So I said, what's the goal, right? What are we looking to do? And he looked at me and he said, well, we're going to need to run it like 1,000 times a day. And I said, well, that's definitely a problem, right? 45 minutes of a runtime 1,000 times a day, you're never going to catch up. So performance and scalability, right? So bugs or errors, there are times when our stuff's completed and the end results, they just aren't correct, right? They could be related to missing or extra or even incorrect data that's being returned. Maybe some formulas were wrong, perhaps one of the columns in the table that you had been working with for development purposes, maybe it was never populated with a value in production. Maybe the process that you were hoping that was running to fill that, maybe it isn't in production, right? Maybe it was a dev process too. So any number of these things, could require a fix or a correction. We talk about maintenance or simplification. So if a process that we generated or we worked on, and when I say we, right, it may not even be you in particular, it may be the company or wherever you're at, if that process is difficult or it's time consuming to transition it from one client to another or from one customer to another, or it might even be error prone, that can be a great reason to take a look at it and to do some redevelopment work. If there are a lot of steps for an internal user to consume that data even, or the process could be streamlined, you might be able to make it less error prone. So those, while I sort of talk a little bit about errors there, the idea of just simplification, can go across several of these different topics. So scope changes, right? This one, oh my goodness, in my opinion is one of the toughest reasons for redevelopment. And in my opinion, it's really super frustrating if you were the original developer. There are times where you've started working on something, you've gotten all of your requirements, you've done your due diligence, and you get to the end, you've gone through testing, and then, one reason or another, somebody says, hey man, this is just not what we needed. Whether we were wrong or they were wrong, they gave us the wrong stuff, notwithstanding, who knows, you got to start over from scratch. So that's a reason that, we might redo something. So if you have system or topography changes, right? So what if our environment gets new hardware? So first, awesome, right? We're getting new hardware. Secondly, oh my goodness, now we've got to talk about transitioning things like processes or jobs or packages, database, objects, the gamut, right? So if you're taking that opportunity to do that, right, to transition that into a new environment, similarly, you could also be splitting duties from a current server to multiple servers, right? So that you have, a dedicated SSRS server now or a dedicated server that runs your SSIS packages. So depending on the initial development, right, this might be a reason that you would need to revisit that process. What is affected if I move my, my source data to a different database server, or I run my SSIS package from a different place in the environment. Platform changes, right? So this is sort of similar to any sort of system or topography changes, but what if you upgraded to a new version of the software, right? What if instead of changing our SSIS server, right, and putting a new box in place, what if we just upgraded the version of SQL Server that was running on it? Are there new features that we can take advantage of? Are there any things that are broken, right? Are there any bugs or any known things that happen with this new version that we need to be on the lookout for? Great example, the cardinality functionality that changed, right? Is my SQL going to return me back the same thing that I was expecting before, right? So these are all reasons and items why we might look at that redevelopment from a migration standpoint. So outside sources, right? How many times have you been working with an outside vendor and maybe they provide you data for consumption? So maybe they provide you a list of, customers or addresses perhaps, and, you're receiving that data from them, you're bringing it into your environment, you're massaging it, doing what you need to do with it so that you can apply it to your own data, and the vendor says, hey, upcoming, we're having a change, right? Maybe we're giving you more data, maybe we're changing the format, the format that's there, so it's going to be a whole new different format, and you're going to have to redevelop the way that you consume that data. So outside sources can influence this sort of redevelopment. And then finally, we talk about abandoned projects or processes or priority shifts. You know, there are times where you may be working on something very heavily. It may be very important. It may be a business need that's required, and the business may change gears with what they're doing, right? Maybe they had an acquisition. Maybe they have changed priorities from what's going to be important to them, you know, so they're sort of driving that idea. So they come back and they say, hey, Jason, you know, I know you've been working really hard on, you know, process, you know, Y. Don't, you know, don't work anymore on that. Let's go ahead and set it to the side. And then maybe in 6 months, they come to me or they come to another developer and they say, hey, listen, that project that Jason was working on a while back, our initiative is back on the table. We want to see you, you know, work on that and get that going again, right? So any of these can be ideas for why we might perform that redevelopment. And you could have things that fall into a number of these categories, right? It's not that you just have one reason to do it. You may have several. You may encompass, you know, one, several, all of these things. So what's going to be important to us as we're evaluating this redevelopment effort and is important that we want to make sure that we handle, right? So if you're faster, if you're utilizing less resources, if you're correcting the data, those, in my opinion, they're all pretty straightforward, right? They include a number of obvious benefits, and whether you're an IT person or you're a business person or you straddle the line or you just, you know, you do whatever, if I said to you, hey, I want to make your process of collecting the number of widgets that we sold last year faster, it doesn't really matter who you are or, you know, what your role is. You're going to immediately say, hey, I know what that is. That light bulb's going to go off, and you say, I know what faster is, right? It's pretty straightforward. So when we talk about the next one, I had streamlining or I had simplifying, and they're similar, but slightly different in regard to, in my opinion, what the relation is important for this redevelopment effort. So streamlining, when we talk about the process, is the idea of removing or consolidating the number of steps that may be required to complete that process. Simplification relates to the complexity of those individual steps. So these two efforts, while they can work together, it is likely or very possible that they'll have an inverse relationship, and you can streamline the process and make it less steps while, you know, you affect you know, how simple the process is, right, at the cost of that process simplification. So they sometimes can work together, but a lot of times they'll inversely work, you know, against each other. And finally, the data utilization. So this one, the concept of the data that's being used and what's consuming it is important to our redevelopment efforts. So, you know, you may have been in places or you may have seen processes that, let's say they retrieve a large number of columns, you know, they're really wide or they have a lot of records, so they're really tall sets, and you only utilize a couple of those columns, you know, or a couple of those records. You know, maybe we pull back a whole bunch of records, you know, we pull back 1 million records to trim down to 1,000. Right? You know, the idea is that the most efficient way to do that? Is there a better way that we can utilize that data? You know, are we taking that large data set and are we shuffling that around? You know, are we manipulating that data set, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 times over the course of the process, you know, as we sort of iteratively, well, crazy, work through that and change that data? And, you know, furthermore, do we have tables or databases involved that we may not even need anymore? You know, are there tables that were populated with data for maybe an old process when it was originally developed? You know, we've moved forward, you know, fast forward in time, maybe that process isn't used anymore. Maybe, you know, our environment doesn't, you know, we don't have that data. So that's another, you know, idea and step of that data utilization. So where can I focus, right? So I've got my development effort, right? Where do I feel it's appropriate that I try and focus? So we could try and focus on the T-SQL, right? We could say, you know, hey, is this code that we're using, right? Is it the best way to write this? Can I speed it up? Can I correct the data, right? Can I do that in the T-SQL? Is there perhaps indexing that can help me out here? You know, are we doing stuff row by row? Are we doing things in sets? You know, how does the T-SQL look that you might be working with? Can you optimize there? From SSIS, you know, are we using components with functionality that can be pushed to other portions of the process that might speed things up? You know, things like sorting or aggregation. Is there a way that we could do that at the source side instead of having to do that on the SSIS side, right? That may help with our performance. You know, similarly, are we performing things row by row, or are we doing things in sets? You know, I think of the OLEDB command that you have in SSIS. You know, yeah, it definitely lets you work with a data flow, right? Your data flow may have X number of records in it, but it's going to fire that thing off, you know, X number of times for how many records you have. Is there a way that you can transition that and work with it in a set instead of doing that row by row? You know, maybe there's a way you can do that. So clarity, right? This one is not necessarily a technological related item. You know, it's, does the process make sense? Do you need to spend a lot of your redevelopment effort kind of determining what was going on or why it was required in the first place, or, you know, what the whole idea was behind the process? You know, if that's the case, right? If it's a bunch of spaghetti and it's tough to, you know, it's tough to really determine what's going on, you know, perhaps some additional documentation, which I know is a four-letter word, right? And everybody always cringes when I say documentation. But maybe if you add that documentation, it'll help out in your effort and the next developer's effort, right? And that, you know, my little anecdote that I had earlier was, hey, that future developer was actually me, because I said, hey, I guess, well, I was the one that had worked on this, right? So it can only benefit, you know, other people or yourself, right? It's only going to be helpful in the future. So other technology, right? So is this process one that we might be providing data exports to the business, and they're using those to generate reports or make decisions? You know, is it possible that this might be a problem that we could solve with a reporting solution, right? Maybe instead of having a bunch of flat files come out, maybe it would make more sense if we could encapsulate it in a report for them. Or, you know, maybe they're already using, you know, things like Power Pivot, you know, and we just need to give them the data so they can get to it. Maybe it's a situation where, you know, you're lucky enough to work with your team and you're getting some new hardware. You know, we talked about, you know, system changes. Maybe you're getting some new hardware, and part of the redevelopment effort, you know, ends up being that transformation or that migration effort. And then finally, we have data. And I put this one in bold, right? I highlighted this one because as I look at things, right, in my opinion, I feel like it's the most important aspect of what you can focus on. You know, being familiar with the data, the format that you have, right, the columns, the size, you know, of those columns, you know, the number of records that you have, projected growth of that data, you know, any constraints or keys, you know, between tables, those are all beneficial for your process, and they're going to drive you in terms of what changes you may be able to make or what changes you may be able to see. And bear with me, this is the last slide I have, and then from a talking perspective, we'll get into some demos next. So just bear with me, everyone. I know they're boring, they don't have a lot of pictures, they're not real flashy, so just bear with me. So finally, the actual questions, right? Let's talk about what questions you actually are going to ask. So this first question of why are we revisiting the process? Hopefully this one is answered by any number of the reasons that we ran across on our why do we redo slide. You know, usually it's already answered, but I have heard things like, hey, you know, we haven't had any projects that have been sponsored for this business unit for a while. They want us to go ahead and work on this one, and, you know, they want to make it faster or what have you, right? So it always usually comes back to one of those items on the redo slide. In the event that the process, it might not even seem like it needs redevelopment, but with your attention to detail, you may be able to find aspects of it to enhance, again, even if it's just the documentation. The next one I have bold, right? It's super simple, and it's just, do you use it, right? This one is such an important question, and it's definitely one that can be difficult and can be tough sometimes to get a straight answer on, or it can just be difficult to have a real good answer on, right? Who's actually using this, and who owns this process? I've seen things across the board, from objects like tables to whole databases, packages, reports, cubes, right? Even cubes, right? I've seen SSAS cubes where we talk about redevelopment efforts and we find out they don't even use them. Cubes. Oh my goodness, cubes. It hurts inside when I think about it sometimes. So in that questioning, right, you should be able to decide how the process is being used. If it's a file, it's being generated as a report, does the end user, do they modify it? Does it just get forwarded straight to the client or the customer? If they do modify it, is it because that data isn't correct or the process needs to be fixed during this effort? Is the process supporting a different business unit, or is it serving a different purpose than it was originally intended for? There are times where, it sort of becomes a situation where I've developed this for, one business unit, another business unit hears about it, so they kind of latch onto it, they kind of use it too, but then they do their own stuff as well to like modify that data, or, to kind of present it in a different way. So, are those adjustments that you can help to make things better, not just for the original owner of it, but also the new owner of it? Is this process one that you feel comfortable enough making changes on it? Do you need to spend some time to determine all the moving pieces that are here? Do you have an idea about the scope of the process? Do you need to look at any release notes or what's new for versions of SQL that you may be able to leverage, and especially in terms of a migration or a system change? Are there new features that you need to look at and say, hey, does it make sense to try and use this new feature for what I was doing? Heck, does it even make sense to look at a current feature? I think about things like change data capture or change tracking or temporal stuff. Do one of those features meet your needs, and do they help you maybe with some of the items that may have been home rolled as part of this process originally? You never know, but it's a question that you definitely want to ask. Is there something newer that might help for us? Is the process following best practices? So do you have a set of best practices in your environment? If you do, is this process following them? Do you just need to take a look at the changes that have happened most recently in the best practices and apply those to this particular process? Is this process old enough that it is before best practices, right? It predates even the original best practices, and it's going to be a ground up to apply best practices. These are questions, right? Questions to have. Similarly, the next one I ask, where is it located? So is it in source control? Please tell me it's in source control, right? Source control is, from a development standpoint, one of my favorite things to talk about it, and I can preach up one side and down the other about the virtues of source control, and I won't here, but the idea of, are you using source control for it? Maybe the newest version is just what's live on the server and deployed there. Maybe it's in a file share somewhere. How and where is that process stored? And I talk about the process, this one more like an SSIS package, but it could be anything for the process, right? Just where is that source data located? And then finally, the most important one that you should be able to answer after we've talked about, why you do things is, what can I change, right? What can I focus on? We talked about the areas, we talked about why we might need to do the development. So this, what can I change, it basically should be just about ready to be answered at this point. So let's kind of switch gears a bit, and we've kind of been talking about the idea behind that redevelopment, right? Just kind of getting your mind going with questions that you can ask and how to maybe blend the development work that you do with the business units. So it's not just a standpoint of I sit down and I hammer away and I get the process done. You really help to engage whoever the owner is for that, and you're able to make the process better, in any of the ways we talked about, faster, less resources, correct, etc. So let's have a demo, right? I've talked for quite a bit straight, so let's have a quick demo here. So we're going to be looking at a demo where I've got two tables, and I don't have a lot of data in these tables. There's like, I don't know, 10 records. I mean, they're very small. So the idea behind the demos that we're going to see are not necessarily performance related. They are to illustrate kind of what will be easier to read and how you'll know in the future kind of what things are doing. So let me bring up my SSMS here. Give me just a second. Okay. So to start off with, I've got just a couple of tables, right? And they're very simple, right? Oh, sorry about that. So I've got just a person table, right? So I got an ID in here, and then I've just got a first name and a last name, and then you can see, man, zoom it. I always struggle. I feel like I use the zoom it, and then I do a presentation, and I immediately forget how to use it. It's terrible, so just bear with me. So my second table is some sales transactions, right? I have a person ID here that ties back to my person table. I just have a sales date and amount, and then I'm just using a payment type for this for purposes of, you know, is it a check, is it Discover, cash, MasterCard, Visa. So these tables, they're just for the purposes of illustrating my demo. You know, you may find out that, you know, having a payment type table makes sense, right? So you can tie a key here, you know, to follow the appropriate, you know, normalization forms. But for me, right, I want to illustrate just some purposes, not necessarily the design of the tables themselves. So let's take a look at just a quick piece of SQL here, right? So I've got my person table, right? I'm just going to return everything. I'm going to return everything from person, and I'm going to left join my sales transaction table. So I'm joining on my person ID. So there's not really anything special going on here, right? This is normal, standard, run-of-the-mill things that you've seen before. So if I run this, you know, we see that, you know, I had 4 transactions. My buddy Tom Jones had 3. Sally had 1, and then you can see Rebecca here. She hasn't had any sales yet. So no problem, pretty straightforward, right? Nothing unusual here. This is a standard left outer join that we're probably all used to seeing. So let's say I only was interested in the cash, right? The cash related transactions. There have been times where I've been working with T-SQL, you know, things that I've worked with, things that others have worked with, and I've seen things like this. So the first, you know, question that we have as we're walking through it, right? I've got my person table. I'm going to left outer join my sales transaction. So I'm interested in all of the transactions. You know, I'm interested in all the people, and if they have sales transactions, I want to join those, right? But I'm only interested in the cash transactions that we have. So when I run this, you know, you can see that all I receive, oh, that's the wrong key. All I get are my cash transactions, which is fine, and I get them for myself, Tom, and then Sally. But if we think about what this logic is saying when we look at it, right, what as someone coming in, if I was to look at this, I'd say, but you told me that you wanted all of the, you know, people, regardless of whether they had sales transactions or not, and then you're going to say that you only want, you know, things that are cash. So this really isn't a left outer that we see here, right? This is not a left outer join that we have here, right? This is actually, and you can see that the engine handles this. This is actually an inner join, right? So we've told SQL, hey, left outer join that sales transaction table, but I only want things where they're cash value, and it's gonna go ahead and just make that an inner join for you, right? It ignores what you've said. It says, man, I know that's not really a left outer, it's actually an inner. You know, in the event that you have a payment type of null, right? So for our Rebecca that doesn't have any sales, her value of null that comes back for her sales transaction, null equals cash is going to fail, right? It's gonna go ahead and get rid of that on us. So this is actually an inner join, right, that we see. So what if we push that where clause, right? What if we push that where clause into our on statement, right? So from a data perspective, maybe this is more what you were interested in seeing, right? So what we've said was I'm left outer joining that sales transaction table to get transactions where we had a person that may not have had a sale, but for ones that did have a sale, right, for transactions that we do have matching records for, I only want those cash ones. I only want those cash transactions. So I get 4 records here, right? I get Rebecca's record with no transactions, and then the other 3 that did have sales transactions. If we look at the execution plan for this, you can see that SQL, the engine did respect our idea that we had wanted a left outer join there and not necessarily an inner join. So if we wanted to write, if we wanted that same result set where I had cash transactions or no transactions, if I wanted to write that the same way with my left outer and the where clause, I would just say where my cash payment is cash, right? And my payment type is null. So or cash or null, right? And then that returns us back what we were looking for. And you can see that the execution plan for this is similarly another arrow going the wrong way, another left outer join, right? So it kept our idea that we wanted that left outer join. So I know that this example seems kind of silly, and it seems, just so simple of why you would want that, but depending on where or what you have in that where clause, even though you may have specified a left outer, right, it may be functioning as an inner join. And from a performance perspective, right, you're not going to gain any performance by changing that left outer to an inner in that particular case, because the engine is already doing that before you behind the scenes, right? It's already saying, hey, that's really an inner join that's happening there. What the important thing here is that it helps you to show that intent, right? I'm interested in only people that had sales transactions, right? I'm not interested in any people that didn't have sales transactions. So it's important to not, not from a performance perspective, but just from an intention perspective of the next person that picks this up, right? Because when I look at things, I say, oh, left outer join, so you don't mind if there are records in that table or not, right? An inner join, I immediately say, well, you definitely are interested only if there are records in that table. So it helps with the idea of what your intent is in the actual T-SQL. Because a lot of times the people that may have written this T-SQL, they may not be here anymore, right? They may not be here to ask and say, hey, when you wrote this left outer, did you really mean an inner, right? Are you really trying to filter on that or not? So just something to think about. The next demo I have is we're talking about extraneous tables, right? So I had mentioned that, as you're going through it, maybe you had the initial development and you were using a table, you realize that there wasn't actually anything used from that table. Maybe that table was added into the SQL select that was there, and it wasn't actually returning any records, right? So what does the optimizer do if you've got a table in there where you're not returning any columns? So we'll take a quick peek. We'll take a quick peek here, and I've got my same data sets again. My person at the top, my sales transaction, and then I did add, just as a simple example, right, I added this favorite color, table of favorite colors. So we have a person, right, and then we have a color. So in this particular format, one person's only going to have one favorite color. So let's look at some data, right? So the first thing I want to do is similar to before. I'm just going to left join, all my sets that are in here. And if we take a look, right, you can see that, my favorite color is, oh, that's not an arrow. My favorite color is noted as orange. Tom's favorite color was noted as black, and then both Sally and Rebecca don't have any favorite colors, shown or there. So let's see what happens if we take our data set that's coming back, right? Let's just say I'm interested in only the items from the person table, right? I'm interested in person, and I'm interested in stuff from the sales transaction. I'm not even using this favorite color, right? I've added it in the join. We've got the appropriate on clause here, but I'm not actually returning anything for it. So let's see what things look like. And I'd filtered by only items that were cache, right? So this is using my example before, right? This is actually an inner join, and I should have written my SQL to show that, and that was probably an oversight on my side. So do as I say, not as I do, right? But you can see that in our result set, right, we have the stuff from the person table, we have the stuff from the sales transaction table. I didn't return any of the color-related information, but let's take a look at the execution plan. In the execution plan, you can see that I have sales transaction, I have our person, and I also have that favorite color table. So even though I'm not using that table, nothing is coming back on that table in my return. It's a left outer join, so it's not filtering any of the data that is used in my result set, and I don't have anything in the where clause for it. The optimizer is still, it's still got that table, right? It's still got that table as part of the plan. And this type of behavior happens in both the 2012 RTM and it happens in the 2016 RTM, right? So my next example is, well, if I'm not using that favorite color table, right? Let's remove that favorite color table. Let's see what we have, right? So from a data set perspective, right? These things look exactly. Oh, that is definitely not what I wanted. These items look exactly the same, right? The data sets are exactly the same. The execution plan, you can see the top one again. We're using that favorite color table, even though we're not bringing anything back from it. And the bottom one, you can see that we've removed that favorite color, right? So same stuff coming back. It's a cheaper, it's a cheaper cost for this query. We don't have to interrogate a table that we don't need. And it's sort of a trivial example, right? I only have a couple of records in there. There's not millions and millions of records, but from a standpoint of, if you had a table that had a lot of records in it, it's very likely that, those moving this out could gain you some performance, right? And then let's see, my last example here is I was only returning records that had a favorite color, right? So I should only return people in here that had a favorite color and they had a cache transaction, right? So similarly, same thing we saw before. We've got just these two, just myself and Tom, because we're the only two people that had favorite colors set. And if I look at my execution plan, right? Oh, there we are. It's interesting to note, right? We're using, we do see a hash match here because we're adding our color and our sales transactions together, right? We're matching those, and then we're matching into our person data. So again, depending on how you're utilizing that data, whether you've got those columns coming back or you aren't using them at all, or you're just using them to perhaps filter things, obviously you're going to get different plans for those. But the idea of, hey, if I don't need a table and I'm not using it for filtering, I'm not using it to return data, right? Get it out of there, right? It doesn't need to be in there. And part of that, part of the reason that I put this demo after the inner versus the outer is if you are putting your SQL together and you've got the idea of, hey, this is truly an inner, and I know that I need this table data plus this table data, right away, hey, is something that I can remove, right? Am I filtering on this just by the idea of saying, is it an inner or an outer join, right? So the previous example we talked about, you can apply the same sort of knowledge here and come up with the same sort of, it's easier on the onset to look at it and say, hey, I can just go ahead and pull it out of there. I don't need it. So, tables that are not, going to be included in your result sets, go ahead and pull them out of the SQL. The engine is not going to pull those out for you, from the RTM, right? So there may be changes for service packs that will affect that particular behavior. But the idea being that you're going to go ahead and clarify what you're looking to do with that SQL. And in this case, you may even see some performance increases, right? Because you've removed the need to even hit that table and to handle things like joining to that table to take that out of the processing standpoint. Oh, that was the wrong button. Let's see, extraneous tables. We're on this guy. Sorry, I gotta restart my slideshow. I accidentally stopped it. Oh, come on, seriously. Okay, so next example I wanted to talk about was using case and aggregates to pivot data. So there have been times where I've been, at places or I've been working with other people, and I see something similar to this kind of structure, right? So I've seen this before, and it's sometimes it can just be a copy and paste type thing, right? And here's a simple way that we may be able to get around it and talk about that. So data set wise, I put together some aggregation here, right? So I'm going to sum my amounts, and I'm going to sum the number of transactions that I have for each person and their particular payment type, right? So this is, something pretty straightforward that we've seen, right? If we look at the code, right, just a simple sum, and I'm just doing count one for the transaction. We're grouping by the first name, the last name, and the payment type. So what I've seen, before is I've seen situations where people have said, well, I want to return, maybe my cash and my Discover card sales. And my examples here are trivial, right? They've only got a person and they've got a sales transaction table. Maybe there are 5 or 6 different tables involved here. Maybe there's a whole bunch of things in the where clause, right? Maybe, maybe they are, much more in depth than just the idea of, hey, my 2 tables. But the key thing between all of the data sets that we're going to return, they're using the same tables and they're returning like the same data. So in our case, we're returning sales amounts, and we're going to want the counts that go with them. So I've seen things like this where they'll write data into temp tables, right? So we'll write our cash stuff right into cash totals. We'll write our Discover stuff into Discover totals, right? So we insert a couple of records, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to work with these, these data sets in just a few. But as you're working through the data, right, you may see, oh, hey, we need to return check sales, right? So you can see that on, April 28th in 2015, somebody added this per Tom in sales, right? So now we have check totals, right? And then in, on 8/3 in 2015, Tom in sales again said, hey, man, I want MasterCard sales, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll get our MasterCard totals. And then finally on, in January of 2016, Tom again said, hey, man, I need some Visa stuff, right? So what we end up having is we have, 5 temp tables, right, that have the cash transactions, the Discover card, the check, the MasterCard, and the Visa, right? So we've got all those transactions in there. And what I've seen is, we'll go ahead and we want all of the people, right? So we're going to drive from the person table, and then we do something like this, right, where we select the sum of the amount from our cash totals, where those person IDs are equal, and we want to store that as cash amount, right? And then we do counts, and we do the sum and the count for all the rest of these, right? So you can see that, similar to what we saw above, right? 428, we added this, 83, we added this, 19, we added this, right? So what we end up with is we end up with a long, a long pivoted out record of names and then cash amounts and the count, across for our different transactions, right? If we didn't have any transactions, then you can see that we had 0 counts and we had $0, right? So one of the items, this is where, we talked about earlier, maybe when you were doing your testing, right? Like maybe this worked out, well for a smaller data set, right? Maybe we were only doing, a couple thousand records, maybe it was small, and you take it into production and you want to try and run this type of structure, right? Where you would insert in your totals and then select them all at the end. You wanted to do all of that, for 1 million records, right? This is not something that may be necessarily performance. It may not be performance that you're looking for. The execution plan for this is quite significant, right? We're table scanning everything, right? It's bringing all that stuff back together. It's joining all of it together. So one of the ways that you could try and get around that, right? Let's talk about the idea of using a sum or a count for these and a case statement inside, so we can set the appropriate payment type that they are, so we can get things like cash amount or discover amount or those kind of things. This is, as you can see this kind of stuff online, Jeff Moden, I believe, talks about these kind of things as like a crosstab type pivot, where you're using your case statements to go ahead and help pivot those things out. So if we were to try and run this, you can see that I get the same sort of data set, right, where I get the summations and I get the counts, for each one of these different categories. And I didn't go through and write that stuff into temp tables and then go ahead and sum or count all of those temp tables, right? The one item that's important to note here is in my case statements, I'm not joining on the payment, or I'm not grouping on my payment type, right? I've got a group on my person ID, my first name, and my last name. And because the payment type is found inside of our aggregate, right, we don't need to group on that. So for the sums, I say, hey, if it's cash, then we'll use the amount, otherwise we'll use 0. For the counts that are in here, if the payment type is cash in this case, then I do want to count it as a record. I have no else statement in here, right? There's no else here. So if it doesn't match this, right, if my record that I'm looking at is actually a payment type of DISC for Discover, this value would be a null, right? So when I do this count, I count all of the ones and all of the nulls. So if we look at the messages for this select that we ran, right, you can see that SQL is letting us know, hey, listen, there were no null values that were in here for the aggregates that you talked about. We need to go ahead and, we're going to eliminate those, right? So we eliminate those values. So it still gives you the right answer, but there's a warning in there. So if we wanted to remove those, right, so I can run this same sort of select. It's got the same columns in here. We don't have that message, right? And the difference being, I changed these, instead of being a sum and then a count, I changed each one of these to be a sum. So for the counts, even if they're counts, I still want to sum them. So if it's a payment type of cash, I want it to be a 1. Otherwise, if that record is not a cash transaction record, it can be a 0. So if it was a Discover record, right, it would be a 0. So at the end, I'm going to sum up all my 1s and 0s, and I'll end up with a number of transactions. So these are all, just some different ways that you can look at that idea of aggregation, and it may not be something like this, right? It may not be something that you've seen that is doing a select sum and account from a temporary table like this, to get our column values. But this idea of doing a sum and account with the case, right? It's another item that you can put in your can put in your cap and you can use it, and maybe it'll make sense, right? From a performance perspective, even if we take the one that complained about the nulls, right? My query cost, right? SQL, the engine feels like this cost for the one where we were looping through all those temp tables and grabbing those values, right? Aggregating all those counts and sums. It says it's 85% of this batch, right? So it's the expensive part of it. So I know we're getting close to time. So this one, right, the demo I wanted to show you was just copy and paste will get you there, right? And there are times where, you may just be adding on just, hey, I need cache, or I need Visa, or I need Discover, right? It's just really easy to copy and paste those. But at some point, you may be at a crossroads where you may say performance, migration purposes, hey, can we reevaluate this whole process? So let me move. So final thoughts, right? So always in development, right? There's times we're taking care of that low-hanging fruit where that additional positive progress that you make is going to start to slow, and it's going to take more time to implement and to make positive changes in your processes. In the face of those diminishing returns, it's possible that you have to step back and just say, hey, you know what? This is as good as it's going to get right now. At the current time, I've done enough, right? I can't spend any more time working on this to take a process that may be a process that takes a second to take it down to a sub-second. Maybe my efforts are better served in taking a process that runs in minutes down to seconds instead, right? So diminishing returns is always something that you want to think about. Anytime you're working with your redevelopment, make sure you get a chance to test your ideas and your coding changes with data sets that mimic your production environment, right? Don't go working and testing things that don't have the same number of records, or they have different data sets or types or things like that, right? You want to try and mimic your production as close as possible. Testing is important, and there's never really a time where it's not going to be beneficial to test. Testing will never hurt you. And for future redevelopment, it's always important to remember that once you've gotten it good enough, that bar can change and shift in the future. Technology is always moving quickly. There's always brilliant people out there that are coming up with better ways to do things every day. And don't look at a redevelopment effort as a failure of whoever the original design or author was. Look at it as an opportunity to make things better and to challenge yourself to learn and to grow in the field. So I appreciate everybody hanging around. Erica, if there were any questions, go ahead and email me those. I can go ahead and see about, I'll reach out to people that had questions, and depending on what they are, I may put up a blog post regarding what we're talking about. So we can go ahead and do it that way, because I know I ate up all the time.
No problem. That sounds good, and I'll get that information to you. Thanks again, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining our free webinar today. As always, we will be sending all registrants a follow-up email, including a link to the full recording of today's webinar. You can also find the recording on our website at pragmaticworks.com. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday for another free training session.